Hey, so it's me again. I've already drank my energy drink, and now I just wanted to get some stuff out of my system. Not out of my system necessarily because it's bad, but just the thoughts I've been having. Because my life, as I've been mentioning lately, has been pretty good lately. Like it's been impressive just how well things are working out for me, and I'm really glad about that. Really happy, but it does get me kind of like wondering about some things. So I wrote down two things on my notes app that I want to talk about, and but yeah, so the past 2 days they've been pretty good. Like I have had things that I wanted to say, but I was busy with like other stuff, schoolwork, also my writing, so I was kind of like more focused on that. But there's are things like the first, no, let me start with the second one so I can kind of like say it and then later on I connect with this. But basically I've been observing how my family, like how my extended family, how like we are. And for example, when I'm thinking about my grandma and my grandpa, particularly on my mom's side, how independent and autonomous that they are, and kind of like how this has translated into me without even like noticing how I've absorbed some of like that. And also actually with my upbringing, my parents, they always like make an effort to make me kind of like for me to be able to do things on my own. So like I was so when I was younger, I was already had a lot of like I was aware of my responsibilities as a kid, but also what they would become once I turned into an adult. And I think that was a very interesting dynamic, because in some ways it might have kind of like not traumatized me, that's a very strong word, but like it has kind of like conditioned me to like be anxious about some stuff that I'm trying to this day to kind of like no longer be so anxious about. Like one example is like my financial life, financial stability. Like that is something that's always been like very important. I mean, of course financial stability is important for everybody, but like that was something that would kind of like destabilize me at certain points in the past. So that was, but yeah, I'm gonna talk about this later. Just how saying, because for example I'm talking about my grandma and my grandpa, and how like they're both very independent, and they kind of like doing their own things. They don't like to be kind of like left to their own devices from time to time, because people like they come with like expectations and desires, and sometimes like you have a pace that you work on. Like I think that the pace that I have was much the pace my mom has, which is just kind of like very accelerated. It just sometimes like that can be kind of like connected, but I'm just really happy with the pace because I get to do everything. And also like it's one of those things that like your pace is really conditioned to like who you are as a person. So like when you're able to operate in your like you're doing things at your own time, you end up being kind of like more satisfied. Because for example my dad, it's interesting because I have ADHD, and both my parents also have ADHD, but it's interesting kind of like how it manifests differently for them. So a very brief kind of like quick example that I can give is that, for example, my mom and I, we kind of like we always listen to stuff on WhatsApp or messages at like twice the speed, and I'm always happy when this is a functionality, be it like a message or a video or anything. And it's interesting because my dad, so and we kind of like listening quickly because that's kind of like how it holds our attention. But my dad on the other hand, like if kind of like things are too quickly, then they kind of like lose him. So I think that both the situations have to do with our ADHD. But it's interesting that kind of like we have I feel sometimes I feel like I can understand, because I feel there's some things like in our family that now I'm talking about nuclear family, my parents, myself, and my brother, who also has ADHD. So I think that because my parents, even if they didn't have a diagnosis when they were younger, I think they kind of like there's this feeling that like, oh, they get it, like they kind of like understand how some things are challenging, some things are kind of like difficult to kind of like go about them. So like they are very understanding and supportive, and then they kind of like they've always tried to help me instead of like condemning me for something that I couldn't do. So I think that is interesting thing, which I think comes from like their upbringing, because as I said, like my grandparents, like like they've been separated since like 88, but like they do live like one by each other's side, not in the same house, because that is not conductive to usually it's one of those things that like, particularly like right now they're in their 80s, like they want to have peace, and sometimes like together, lots of food, lots of stuff there. But what I was trying to say is that I think because my grandparents, for example, like looking at my mom's lineage, because they're very independent, they want to do things on their own. They're not very it's not that they don't rely on people, but it's just that they prefer to, they kind of like really value their autonomy. And I think that it kind of like led to I could also dissect my aunts and uncle, but I think that it kind of like instilled that in her, for her to be independent, for her to be in charge of, like things in her life, and for her to plan ahead. And I think that's very important. And I think that she kind of like was able to instill that into me. My parents, my grandparents on my dad's side, I don't know enough about my grandpa, to be honest. He died when I was 8, so I didn't really have many, like, my perceptions of him are very much based on the perception of the people who did kind of like deal with him. It's not to say that we didn't have, like, they were not bonding, we were being affectionate, but like, I don't know, I don't think that from like 0 to 8, like, I have like a very concrete idea of who he was. But I do know that my grandma, his wife, she was very she was controlling in some ways, and I think it's kind of like the opposite, because I feel that my mom, she kind of like was able to kind of like become more independent because the way she kind of like was brought up. I feel like my dad, on the other hand, he had this negative experience with like being controlling. My grandma being like, it's not ill intended or anything, it's just that that's kind of like probably how she was brought up, so there's like that cycle. But I feel like my dad kind of like he let me be a little bit more, because he had this negative experience of like being too had to control, so I think that the point is that the way that I was brought up, I think it was apart from like the traumas that I had, like it was really good. I think that the way my parents brought me up was really it was like the best way to set me up for success, and I had my own issues, I had my mental illness, I had my traumas, so of course that it wasn't always like a straightforward journey. But I think that right now that I've been kind of like experiencing this very great level of stability, like I can look back and be like, yes, everything that came before me, like that was really good, like that was like that made me who I am in the best possible way, and I'm kind of like regaining a lot of my independence / autonomy, because for so many years I really needed more direct care because of my episodes and all that, and right now I'm walking towards like a point where I am pretty confident that like in some months I'll probably be able to do a lot more things by myself. I really enjoy having my mom with me, so like we're not gonna completely extinguish that, but it's no longer a matter of like me needing my mom to be there. It's more like I want my mom to be here, which is also like a great distinction that it has a really interesting impact on your psyche. It's pretty much what I'm observing. It's the same thing with like when you don't want to do something, but like as opposed to like you can't do that thing, like it has like this kind of like effect, psychological effect in your brain, so it's kind of like that. But yeah, so I kind of like, I've always valued autonomy and independence. It's always been a very kind of like a almost a value to me, like one of my values, independence, autonomy. And it's interesting because it feels like sometimes right now I'm back to normal. Like it's interesting because I look back and I'm like, okay, it feels like in some ways I have been kind of like I regressed at some certain points. As I said, like there was mental illness to kind of like consider. So like it was not like it was not like a stroll at the park. What I'm trying to say. It was something that happened that really it kind of like it had lasting effects, like there were consequences to the things that happened. And I don't know, I feel like right now I am at a point where things are working out. As I said, my life has been pretty great lately, and I don't understand why. Oh yeah, but this kind of like connects us to the first thing that I wanted to talk about, which now is going to be the second thing, which is because of everything turning out okay. I think I mentioned this the other day, that like me being suffering, when things are bad, like that has never really made me turn to a God figure or religion or anything. But I've been observing that like when everything is working out great, that is pretty much where a certain tendency, there's like a hint of like that showing up. I'm not going to change my beliefs, like at this point in time I'm like, yeah, unless like God presents himself in front of me, like I don't know. But it's interesting that I've been hearing from like different people who used to be atheists and agnostics, and now like they found God and religion, how like their experience had to be very like had to be an experience for them to kind of like turn away. So who knows, I am pretty confident in what I think, what I believe in, which is nothing, but I'm not like opposed to anything. I mean, it would be much better, right, if there was like a divine purpose to what I'm doing, instead of just being what I want to do, because that way that's kind of like this guarantee of success, right? But the point I'm trying to make is that I've been observing that like when everything is working out great, like that is pretty much where I guess like my fears, they come, that fears that something bad is going to happen, that like that, you know, I'm going to lose whatever I have. And it's interesting because, as I said, so like I feel like these are the moments. So basically, I did not grow up Catholic or anything. Like, you know, here is like a majority Catholic country, but I grew up Protestant, so I don't have any Catholic guilt. You know, I don't have feelings like that. You know, because the way that was kind of like brought up is the idea that like God doesn't really punish you, like God doesn't tempt you. You know, like that is usually something that Satan does, I guess. But it's still like there was this fear, and it's interesting because like some of them like have to do with like what I'm going through. Some of them are very like out of nowhere, like they have no indication, there's no hint. I mean, not to be fair, like sometimes things happen, there's no explanation for them. So it's just, you know, like you and yourself, you in your head. And but you know, like so basically what I'm trying to say is that I have been observing that I was trying to think of a better term, but like since I'm going back to when I was, you know, a kid, and how like this is something that started like back then. Basically there's this notion that I had in my head that if I'm not a good girl, I'm not a good person, that, you know, bad things are going to happen to me, which I think is pretty much the gist of Catholic guilt, right? but that's the thing, like I don't fully understand how this developed. It could be kind of like cultural osmosis, because, you know, like if I was surrounded by people who thought that way, but like I was not, up to like when I was like in high school. Like that's when I started to interact with people who are not believers, you know, who are not Christians. So it's kind of like a weird thing for me to have inherited, you know, like I don't know where it came from, but it does come from fear. And I've been talking a lot about fear lately, so this is something that has been kind of like taking up space in my brain, just kind of like me noticing that, oh, I'm kind of like scared that, you know, if I do something wrong, if I don't, it's not if I do something bad, if I don't acknowledge God, you know, like that was kind of like the thing for me that made me, you know, like my journey to get from like, you know, this Christian to this religious Christian environment that I grew up in, to the point where I was just actually able to just express myself in terms of like religion, in my case, like thereof. And it was kind of like a journey, and there was a lot of fear like this, you know, like there was a lot of what's happening was very much, you know, like me being worried that like, oh, I'm gonna say this, so I'm gonna say that I don't believe in this, and then, you know, I'm gonna lose everything, so I will lose, which is pretty much why I think that is when things are good, that I'm kind of like I get closer to, you know, like it's the point that I kind of like get like, okay, I get what people get from religion, what is driving them here. But you know, it's still like, as I said, like nothing really changed in my beliefs, nothing changed in my life to kind of like lead to change, so I don't think any change is going to happen. But at the same time, like it is, you know, something that it kind of it occupies my mind, like this fear, and I don't want to have fear anymore. I don't want to live in fear, like that is very exhausting, you know, and it's also like not the most conductive of living a good productive life. So I want to kind of like go without that fear, that if I don't acknowledge, you know, like God, if I do something bad, or something, maybe it doesn't have to be bad, because I feel like bad can be a charged word, but just something that's a little bit more neutral, kind of like I could have done more, you know, I could have done better, but, you know, I just did that and at that level. And there is a lot to be said about, you know, like this fear. I don't know, I feel like this is not particularly groundbreaking. It is for me to admit this, but I think that a lot of people who have a religious upbringing, they're probably going to share, you know, these thoughts that I have. And but it's just that, you know, like, so I was aware that this, I don't know, I just never really made a connection, and some of it's probably that I didn't want to make the connection, I didn't want to acknowledge some of those fears, because that basically means that I'm not as well resolved as I kind of like I want myself to be. Because if there's a part of me that's fearing, you know, fearing this, it means that there's a part of me that, you know, believes to some extent that there's something. And as I said, like I'm not really trying to kind of like oppose anything or anyone. I'm way past that stage. You know, I just want to kind of like settle and get my things done, and, you know, live my life in a fulfilling way. And I understand that for a lot of people, like that involves, you know, God or belief in a greater force or greater something, but that has certainly not really worked for me, because I've been very self-serving, you know, most of my life. Like instead of like, I also like, I don't like serving. This is also something because I went to the cell group this morning, and basically like we're talking about friendships, and you know, how like you're supposed to kind of like, your life should be testimony, you know, to kind of like what you believe in, which, you know, what makes sense. Like it should, you know, if it is something so transformative, it should transform your life and the way you live it. But basically, we end up talking about interacting. I end up bringing up, like, yeah, I kind of struggle sometimes with interacting with people, because like it's very demanding. It demands like energy, demands time, demands effort. You know, if you want it to be kind of like a good conversation, and a lot of times like I feel like I wanted to be doing anything else. You know, like I would rather be using my time doing something, you know, more self-serving. It doesn't have to be something selfish necessarily, but like something that is going to kind of like, for example, write. You know, like maybe I'm there talking, and in my head I'm like, I could be writing right now. Naturally, like those two things, they don't contradict each other. They don't have to contradict each other. So I can just you know, like it is totally plausible that I can, you know, like write and, you know, have, you know, relationships. When I was in the cell group today, you know, after the meeting was over and we were talking, I ended up striking a conversation with this woman, and she's the mother of, you know, like the girl who the other day I said that maybe we could become friends. And she was, you know, telling me a lot of things. We were talking for like some 20 to 30 minutes, and I'm not gonna lie, some moments there I was like, hope that just waiting for her to finish the story so I could go on with my day, because I had like some stuff to do, some errands to run, you know, because the church is downtown, so it's just like very easily accessible, you know, to other places. So I kind of, like, as I said, I was just ready to go, was more excited about what happened next, but I stayed there, you know, like I lingered and I didn't tune out. I was there and I was just nodding and saying like, oh, interesting. And I know this is not the most engaging conversation, it's not the most meaningful, but it does kind of like show some type of growth for my part, because as I said, like before, I didn't even like want to, you know, like I didn't want to offer people my time, which, you know, which is kind of like, I mean, you could argue that time is like our most valuable resource. So, you know, like if you're giving somebody your time, like you are, you know, doing, particularly if you're like fully giving them your time, you're just not, you know, half-assing it, which was kind of like something that I was tempted to do, but I didn't do. I actually, you know, listened, and, you know, it was what it was. And I don't know, just like giving myself a pat on the back, because this is progress, and it's not only, it's progress that I think that, you know, it's going to kind of like be applied in other areas of my life. You know, I think that, you know, today was interesting because, you know, I didn't want to listen, but what was the worst thing that could happen? Which was just that I sat there and I listened. So, you know, there are worse things. I can, and this is kind of like I said, how we develop like meaningful connections. Sometimes you have to kind of like put in, you know, the work. You always have to put in the work, but you have to kind of like really put in like an extra amount of time and effort to make things blossom, you know. So that is kind of nothing. I heard low, a can, you know, a tin can, but it was nothing. But yeah, so today was like kind of like a good example. But back to the thing I was saying, you know, about fear. I feel like this is one of those situations that the best, you know, way to handle it is by going through it, you know. So like if I'm scared that if I don't do this, if I do that, things are gonna get bad. It's interesting because like there are different types of ways that things can be bad, but, you know, thinking about the worst case scenarios in my head, it's kind of interesting. Like, why is that some things, they really affect me. It's not just for this particular reason, it's just, you know, generalized fear that I have. So I think that the best way forward is true in this particular regard. So I just have to kind of like stay strong and just kind of because there's no part of me that is kind of like unsure, you know, like when it comes to my beliefs. So it's like, why is this? And this has to do with habit, you know, like I grew up in this context, so like naturally I have some fears and anxieties. But there's also you know, something that, you know, we should consider, which is kind of like insecurities, because, you know, insecurities are based on fear, and also like I think fears can be based on insecurities. And I think that, you know, what exactly am I? have to dig deeper and be like, why am I, you know, what's kind of like upsetting me here? Why is that, you know, like, will life be so bad if something happened? And I have talked about this before, but like there are certain things. Anyway, so my dad just called me. I'm gonna go to a friend's house. We're gonna do some artistry, you know, we're gonna do some things. Basically, yeah, she kind of uses the example of Art Attack, you know, like that Disney show, the Disney Channel show, sorry. But yeah, but just kind of like wrap up what I was saying. It's just that I think that there are some fears. For example, when it comes to like disabilities, like that is something. There are some things that I'm like, they're not gonna lie, like the idea of canceling it, like really. I mean, to be fair, like historically, I've always wanted to kind of like end it all for various reasons. But like even now, I'm thinking like that happened. I don't know if I want to move on. And I think that life is just, but that's kind of like life. I think we all have fears, and I think it's just that some fears are irrational, not because they can't happen, like they can, but there are some things you cannot really foresee. Things they're gonna happen, they're gonna happen because there's some things like you cannot really avoid, So like you do what you can, but there's always the element of surprise, you could say. Things can happen, things can go bad. And there's also like looking around, because there is this thing of like, okay, so if like I'm not the only one who is kind of like failing here, and you have to like, so I'm looking all around, like so many examples of that, and they are kind of like just going on just fine. So why would I not, things will not be fine by me. But yeah, so just to wrap it up, I have to kind of like work on some of these fears, because there is this irrational element to some of them. Like they're not really based on anything. Some fears, they are based on something, but there's no indication that things are going to go bad right away, or at all. So like I want you kind of like I don't know, and as I said, like the best way true is true. The best way for me to kind of like for me to overcome these fears is by kind of like just being myself in a certain way, and not being myself just by being myself, but like continue to live my life as I do. And every new day is going to prove that like, okay, there's nothing for me to fear here. Once again, not because there is nothing to fear, but like I'm doing my part. So if something extracurricular happens, like I can control it, and that's that. But yeah, so anyways, bye.